Chapter 14. Albert's Uncle's Grandmother, or the Long Lost.
The shadow of the termination now descended in sable thunderclouds upon our devoted Nobbs. As Albert's uncle said, school now gaped for its prey. In a very short space of time we should be wending our way back to Blackheath, and all the variegated delightfulness of the country would soon be only preserved in memory's faded flowers. I don't care for that way of writing very much. It would be an awful swat to keep it up, looking out the words and all that. To speak in the language of everyday life, our holiday was jolly nearly up. We had had a ripping time, but it was all but over. We really did feel sorry, though of course it was rather decent to think of getting back to father and being able to tell the other chaps about our raft and the dam and the Tower of Mystery and things like that. When but a brief time was left to us, Oswald and Dicky met by chance in an apple tree. That sounds like consequences, but it is merely truthfulness. Dicky said, "Only 4 more days." Oswald said, "Yes." "There's one thing," Dicky said, "that beastly society. We don't want that swarming all over everything when we get home. We ought to dissolve it before we leave here." The following dialogue now took place. Oswald: "Right you are. I always said it was piffling rot." Dicky: "So did I." Oswald: "Let's call a council, but don't forget we're jolly well got to put our foot down." Dicky assented, and the dialogue concluded with apples. The council, when called, was but in low spirits. This made Oswald's and Dicky's task easier. When people are sunk in gloomy despair about one thing, they will agree to almost anything about something else. Remarks like this are called philosophic generalizations, Albert's uncle says. Oswald began by saying,
"We've tried the society for being good in, and perhaps it's done us good. But now the time has come for each of us to be good or bad on his own, without hanging on to the others."
"The race is run by 1 and 1, but never by 2 and 2,
the dentist said. The others said nothing. Oswald went on, "I move that we dissolve the Would-be-Good Society. Its appointed task is done. If it's not well done, then that's its fault, and not ours." Dicky said, "Hear, hear, I second this prop." The unexpected dentist said, "I third it. At first I thought it would help, but afterwards I saw it only made you want to be naughty just because you were a would-be-good." Oswald owns he was surprised. We put it to the vote at once, so as not to let Denny cool. H.O., Noel and Alice voted with us. So Daisy and Dora were what is called a hopeless minority. We tried to cheer their hopelessness by letting them read the things out of the Golden Deed book aloud. Noel hid his face in the straw so that we should not see the faces he made while he made poetry instead of listening. And when the Would-be-Goods was by vote dissolved for ever, he sat up, straws in his hair, and said, "The epitaph."
"The would-be-goods are dead and gone, but not the golden deeds they have done. These will remain upon glory's page, to be an example to every age. And by this we have got to know how to be good upon our N
is for Noel. That makes the rhyme and the sense both right. O-W-N, own. Do you see? We saw it and said so, and the gentle poet was satisfied. And the council broke up. Oswald felt that a weight had been lifted from his expanding chest, and it is curious that he never felt so inclined to be good and a model to youth as he did then. As he went down the ladder out of the loft, he said, "There's one thing we ought to do, though, before we go home. We ought to find Albert's uncle's long-lost grandmother for him."
Alice's heart beat true and steadfast. She said, That's just exactly what Noel and I were saying this morning. Look out, Oswald, you wretch. You're kicking chaff into my eyes. She was going down the ladder just under me. Oswald's younger sister's thoughtful remark ended in another council, but not in the straw loft. We decided to have a quite new place and disregarded H.O.'s idea of the dairy and Noel's of the cellars. We had the new council on the secret staircase, and there we settled exactly what we ought to do. This is the same thing, if you really wish to be good, as what you are going to do. It was a very interesting council, and when it was over Oswald was so pleased to think that the would-be-goods was uncoverishly dead that he gave Denny and Noel, who was sitting on the step below him, a good-humoured, playful, gentle, loving, brotherly shove, and said, "Get along now, it's tea-time." No reader who understands justice and the real rightness of things, and who is to blame for what, will ever think it could have been Oswald's fault that the two other boys got along down by rolling over and over each other and bursting the door at the bottom of the stairs open by their revolving bodies. And I should like to know whose fault it was that Mrs. Pettigrew was just on the other side of the door at that very minute. The door burst open, and the impetuous bodies of Noel and Denny rolled out of it into Mrs. Pettigrew, and upset her, and the tea-tray. Both revolving boys were soaked with tea and milk, and there were 1 or 2 cups and things smashed. Mrs. Pettigrew was knocked over, but none of her bones were broken. Noel and Denny were going to be sent to bed, but Oswald said it was all his fault. He really did this to give the others a chance of doing a refined golden deed by speaking the truth and saying it was not his fault. But you cannot really count on anybody. They did not say anything, but only rubbed the lumps on their late revolving heads. So it was bed for Oswald, and he felt the injustice hard. But he sat up in bed and read The Last of the Mohicans, and then he began to think. When Oswald really thinks, he almost always thinks of something. He thought of something now, and it was miles better than the idea we had decided on in the secret staircase, of advertising in the Kentish Mercury and saying if Albert's uncle's long-lost grandmother would call at the Moat House, she might hear of something much to her advantage. What Oswald thought of was that if we went to Hazelbridge and asked Mr. B. Munn, grocer, that drove us home in the cart with the horse that liked the wrong end of the whip best, he would know who the lady was in the red hat and red wheels that paid him to drive us home that Canterbury night. He must have been paid, of course, for even grocers are not generous enough to drive perfect strangers, and 5 of them too, about the country for nothing. Thus we may learn that even unjustness and sending the wrong people to bed may bear useful fruit, which ought to be a great comfort to everyone when they are unfairly treated. Only it most likely won't be. For if Oswald's brothers and sisters had nobly stood by him as he expected, he would not have had the solitary reflections that led to the great scheme for finding the grandmother.
Of course, when the others came up to roost, they all came and squatted on Oswald's bed and said how sorry they were. He waived their apologies with noble dignity, because there wasn't much time, and said he had an idea that would knock the council's plan into a cocked hat. But he would not tell them what it was. He made them wait till next morning. This was not sulks, but kind feeling. He wanted them to have something else to think of besides the way they hadn't stood by him in the bursting of the secret staircase door and the tea-tray and the milk. Next morning Oswald kindly explained and asked who would volunteer for a forced march to Hazelbridge. The word volunteer cost the young Oswald a pang as soon as he had said it, but I hope he can bear pangs with any man living. And mind, he added, hiding the pang under a general-like severeness, I won't have anyone in the expedition who has anything in his shoes except his feet. This could not have been put more delicately and decently, but Oswald is often misunderstood. Even Alice said it was unkind to throw the peas up at Denny. When this little unpleasantness had passed away, it took some time because Daisy cried and Dora said, "There now, Oswald." There were 7 volunteers, which with Oswald made 8, and was indeed all of us. There were no cockle shells or tape sandals or staves or scrips or anything romantic and pious about the 8 persons who set off for Hazelbridge that morning, more earnestly wishful to be good and deedful, at least Oswald, I know, was, than ever they had been in the days of the beastly would-be-good society. It was a fine day. Either it was fine nearly all last summer, which is how Oswald remembers it, or else nearly all the interesting things we did came on fine days. With hearts light and gay and no peas in anyone's shoes, the walk to Hazelbridge was perseveringly conducted. We took our lunch with us, and the dear dogs. Afterwards we wished for a time that we had left one of them at home, but they did so want to come, all of them, and Hazelbridge is not nearly as far as Canterbury, really, so even Martha was allowed to put on her things, I mean her collar, and come with us. She walks slowly, but we had the day before us, so there was no extra hurry. At Hazelbridge we went into B. Munn's grocer's shop and asked for ginger beer to drink. They gave it to us, but they seemed surprised at us wanting to drink it there, and the glass was warm. It had just been washed. We only did it really so as to get into conversation with B. Munn grocer and extract information without rousing suspicion. You cannot be too careful. However, when we had said it was first-class ginger beer and paid for it, we found it not so easy to extract anything more from B. Munn grocer, and there was an anxious silence while he fiddled about behind the counter among the tinned meats and sauce bottles, with a fringe of hobnailed boots hanging over his head.
H.O. spoke suddenly. He is like the sort of person who rushes in where angels fear to tread, as Denny says. Say what sort of person that is. He said, "I say, you remember driving us home that day? Who paid for the cart?" Of course, B. Munn grocer was not such a nincompoop. I like that word. It means so many people I know, as to say right off. He said, "I was paid all right, young gentleman. Don't you terrify yourself." People in Kent say terrify when they mean worry. So Dora shoved in a gentle oar. She said, "We want to know the kind lady's name and address, so that we can write and thank her for being so jolly that day." B. Munn grocer muttered something about the lady's address being goods he was often asked for. Alice said, "But do tell us, we forgot to ask her. She's a relation of a second-hand uncle of ours, and I do so want to thank her properly. And if you've got any extra strong peppermints at £1 an ounce, we should like £1/4 pound. This was a masterstroke. While he was weighing out the peppermints, his heart got soft, and just as he was twisting up the corner of the paper bag, Dora said, "What lovely fat peppermints! Do tell us." And B. Munn's heart was now quite melted. He said, "It's Miss Ashley, and she lives at the Cedars, about a mile down the Maidstone Road." We thanked him, and Alice paid for the peppermints. Oswald was a little anxious when she ordered such a lot, but she and Noel had got the money all right, and when we were outside the Hazelbridge Green, a good deal of it is gravel really, we stood and looked at each other. Then Dora said, "Let's go home and write a beautiful letter and all sign it." Oswald looked at the others. "Writing is all very well, but it's such a beastly long time to wait for anything to happen afterwards." The intelligent Alice divined his thoughts, and the dentist divined hers. He is not clever enough yet to divine Oswald's. and the two said together, "Why not go and see her?" "She did say she would like to see us again some day," Dora replied. So, after we had argued a little about it, we went.
And before we had gone 100 yards down the dusty road, Martha began to make us wish with all our hearts that we had not let her come. She began to limp, just as a pilgrim who I will not name did when he had the split peas in his silly palmering shoes. So we called a halt and looked at her feet. One of them was quite swollen and red. Bulldogs almost always have something the matter with their feet, and it always comes on when least required. They are not the right breed for emergencies. There was nothing for it but to take it in turns to carry her. She is very stout, and you have no idea how heavy she is. A half-hearted, unadventurous person, name no names, but Oswald, Alice, Noel, H.O., Dicky, Daisy and Denny will understand me, said, "Why not go straight home and come another day without Martha?" But the rest agreed with Oswald when he said it was only a mile and perhaps we might get a lift home with the poor invalid. Martha was very grateful to us for our kindness. She put her fat white arms around the person's neck who happened to be carrying her. She is very affectionate, but by holding her very close to you, you can keep her from kissing your face all the time. As Alice said, bulldogs do give you such large, wet, pink kisses. A mile is a good way when you have to take your turn at carrying Martha. At last we came to a hedge with a ditch in front of it and chains swinging from posts to keep people off the grass and out of the ditch, and a gate with "The Cedars" on it in gold letters, all very neat and tidy, showing plainly that more than one gardener was kept. There we stopped. Alice put Martha down, grunting with exhaustedness, and said, "Look here, Dora and Daisy, I don't believe a bit that it's his grandmother. I'm sure Dora was right, and it's only his horrid sweetheart. I feel it in my bones. Now don't you really think we'd better chuck it? We're sure to catch it for interfering. We always do." "The cross of true love never did come smooth," said the dentist. "We ought to help him bear his cross." "But if we find her for him, and she's not his grandmother, he'll marry her," Dicky said, in tones of gloominess and despair. Oswald felt the same, but he said, "Never mind, we should all hate it, but perhaps Albert's uncle might like it. You never can tell. If you want to do a really unselfish action and no kid, now's your time, my late would-be-goods." No one had the face to say right out that they didn't want to be unselfish.
But it was with sad hearts that the unselfish seekers opened the long gate and went up the gravel drive between the rhododendrons and other shrubberies towards the house. I think I have explained to you before that the eldest son of anybody is called the representative of the family when his father isn't there. That was why Oswald now took the lead. When we got to the last turn of the drive, it was settled that the others were to noiselessly ambush in the rhododendrons, and Oswald was to go on alone and ask at the house for the grandmother from India, Miss Ashley. So he did. But when he got to the front of the house and saw how neat the flower beds were with red geraniums, and the windows all bright and speckless with muslin blinds and brass rods, and a green parrot in a cage in the porch, and the doorstep newly whited, lying clean and untrodden in the sunshine, he stood still and thought of his boots and how dusty the roads were, and wished he had not gone into the farmyard after eggs before starting that morning. As he stood there in anxious uncertainness, he heard a low voice among the bushes. It said, "Hist! Oswald here!" And it was the voice of Alice. So he went back to the others among the shrubs, and they all crowded round their leader, full of important news. "She's not in the house. She's here," Alice said in a low whisper that seemed nearly all S's. Close by. She went by just this minute with a gentleman. And they're sitting on a seat under a tree on a little lawn, and she's got her head on his shoulder, and he's holding her hand. I never saw anyone look so silly in all my born, Dicky said. It's sickening, Denny said, trying to look very manly with his legs wide apart. I don't know, Oswald whispered. I suppose it wasn't Albert's uncle. Not much, Dicky briefly replied. Then don't you see? It's all right. If she's going on like that with this fellow, she'll want to marry him, and Albert's uncle is safe. And we've really done an unselfish action without having to suffer for it afterwards. With a stealthy movement, Oswald rubbed his hands as he spoke in real joyfulness. We decided that we had better bunk unnoticed, but we had reckoned without Martha. She had strolled off limping to look about her a bit in the shrubbery. "Where's Martha?" Dora suddenly said. "She went that way," pointingly remarked H.O. "Then fetch her back, you young duffer. What did you let her go for?" Oswald said. "And look sharp. Don't make a row."
He went. A minute later we heard a hoarse squeak from Martha, the one she always gives when suddenly collared from behind, and a little squeal in a ladylike voice, and a man say, "Hello!" And then we knew that H.O. had once more rushed in where angels might have thought twice about it. We hurried to the fatal spot, but it was too late. We were just in time to hear H.O. say, "I'm sorry if she's frightened you, but we've been looking for you. Are you Albert's uncle's long-lost grandmother?" "No," said our lady, unhesitatingly. It seemed vain to add 7 more agitated actors to the scene now going on. We stood still. The man was standing up. He was a clergyman, and I found out afterwards he was the nicest we ever knew except our own Mr. Briston at Lewisham, who is now a canon or a dean or something grand that no one ever sees. At present I did not like him. He said, "No, this lady is nobody's grandmother. May I ask in return how long it is since you escaped from the lunatic asylum, my poor child, and whence your keeper is?" H.O. took no notice of this at all, except to say, "I think you are very rude, and not at all funny, if you think you are." The lady said, "My dear, I remember you now perfectly. How are all the others, and are you pilgrims again today?" H.O. does not always answer questions. He turned to the man and said, "Are you going to marry the lady?" "Margaret," said the clergyman, "I never thought it would come to this. He asks me my intentions." "If you are," said H.O., "it's all right, because if you do, Albert's uncle can't. At least not till you're dead, and we don't want him to." "Flattering, upon my word," said the clergyman, putting on a deep frown. "Shall I call him out, Margaret, for his poor opinion of you, or shall I send for the police?"
Alice now saw that H.O., though firm, was getting muddled and rather scared. She broke cover and sprang into the middle of the scene. "Don't let him rag H.O. any more," she said. "It's all our faults. You see, Albert's uncle was so anxious to find you, we thought perhaps you were his long-lost heiress sister, or his old nurse who alone knew the secret of his birth or something, and we asked him, and he said you were his long-lost grandmother he had known in India, and we thought that must be a mistake, and that really you were his long-lost sweetheart. And we tried to do a really unselfish act and find you for him, because we don't want him to be married at all." "It isn't because we don't like you," Oswald cut in, now emerging from the bushes. "And if he must marry, we'd sooner it was you than anyone else. Really we would." "A generous concession, Margaret," the strange clergyman uttered. "Most generous. But the plot thickens. It's almost pea-soup-like now. 1 or 2 points clamour for explanation. Who are these visitors of yours? Why this Red Indian method of paying morning calls? Why the lurking attitude of the rest of the tribe which I now discern among the undergrowth? Won't you ask the rest of the tribe to come out and join the glad throng?" Then I liked him better. I always like people who know the same songs we do, and books and tunes and things. The others came out. The lady looked very uncomfy, and partly as if she was going to cry, but she couldn't help laughing too, as more and more of us came out. "And who," the clergyman went on, "who in Fortune's name is Albert, and who is his uncle? And what have they or you to do in this garden?" We all felt rather silly, and I don't think I ever felt more than then what an awful lot of us there were. 3 years' absence in Calcutta or elsewhere may explain my ignorance of these details, but still— "I think we'd better go," said Dora. "I'm sorry if we've done anything rude or wrong. We didn't mean to. Goodbye. I hope you'll be happy with the gentleman, I'm sure." "I hope so too," said Noel, and I know he was thinking how much nicer Albert's uncle was. We turned to go. The lady had been very silent compared with what she was when she pretended to show us Canterbury, but now she seemed to shake off some dreamy silliness, and caught hold of Dora by the shoulder.
"No, dear, no," she said. "It's all right, and you must have some tea. We'll have it on the lawn. John, don't tease them any more. Albert's uncle is the gentleman I told you about. And, my dear children, this is my brother that I haven't seen for 3 years." "Then he's a long lost too," said H.O. The lady said, "Not now," and smiled at him. And the rest of us were dumb with confounding emotions. Oswald was particularly dumb. He might have known it was her brother, because in rotten grown-up books, if a girl kisses a man in a shrubbery, that is not the man you think she is in love with. It always turns out to be a brother, though generally the disgrace of the family, and not a respectable chaplain from Calcutta. The lady now turned to her reverend and surprising brother and said, "John, go and tell them we'll have tea on the lawn." When he was gone, she stood quite still a minute. Then she said, "I am going to tell you something, but I want to put you on your honour not to talk about it to other people. You see, it isn't everyone I would tell about it. He, Albert's uncle, I mean, has told me a lot about you, and I know I can trust you." We said, "Yes," Oswald with a brooding sentiment of knowing all too well what was coming next. The lady then said, "Though I am not Albert's uncle's grandmother, I did know him in India once, and we were going to be married, but we had a misunderstanding." "Quarrel? Row?" said Noel and H.O. at once. "Well, yes, a quarrel, and he went away. He was in the Navy then. And then, well, we were both sorry, but, well, anyway, when his ship came back, we'd gone to Constantinople, then to England, and he couldn't find us, and he says he's been looking for me ever since." "Not you for him?" said Noel. "Well, perhaps," said the lady, and the girls said, "Ah," with deep interest. The lady went on more quickly. "And then I found you, and then he found me, and now I must break it to you. Try to bear up." She stopped. The branches cracked, and Albert's uncle was in our midst. He took off his hat. "Excuse my tearing my hair," he said to the lady, "but has the pack really hunted you down?" "It's all right," she said, and when she looked at him she got miles prettier quite suddenly. "I was just breaking it to them." "Don't take that proud privilege from me," he said. "Kiddies, allow me to present to you the future Mrs. Albert's uncle, or shall we say, Albert's new aunt."
There was a good deal of explaining done before tea, about how we got there, I mean, and why, but after the first bitterness of disappointment, we felt not nearly so sorry as we had expected to, for Albert's uncle's lady was jolly to us, and her brother was awfully decent, and showed us a lot of first-class native curiosities and things, unpacking them on purpose, skins of beasts and beads and brass things, and shells from different savage lands beside India. And the lady told the girls that she hoped they would like her as much as she liked them, and if they wanted a new aunt, she would do her best to give satisfaction in the new situation. And Alice thought of the Murdstone aunt belonging to Daisy and Denny, and how awful it would have been if Albert's uncle had married her. And she decided, she told me afterwards, that we might think ourselves jolly lucky it was no worse. Then the lady led Oswald aside, pretending to show him the parrot which he had explored thoroughly before, and told him she was not like some people in books. When she was married, she would never try to separate her husband from his bachelor friends. She only wanted them to be her friends as well. Then there was tea, and thus all ended in amicableness, and the Reverend and Friendly drove us home in a wagonette. But for Martha we shouldn't have had tea or explanations or lift or anything. So we honoured her and did not mind her being so heavy and walking up and down constantly on our laps as we drove home.
And that is all the story of the long-lost grandmother and Albert's uncle. I am afraid it is rather dull, but it was very important to him, so I felt it ought to be narrated. Stories about lovers and getting married are generally slow. I like a love story where the hero parts with the girl at the garden gate in the gloaming and goes off and has adventures, and you don't see her any more till he comes home to marry her at the end of the book. And I suppose people have to marry. Albert's uncle is awfully old, more than 30, and the lady is advanced in years, 26 next Christmas. They are to be married then. The girls are to be bridesmaids in white frocks with fur. This quite consoles them. If Oswald repines sometimes, he hides it. What's the use? We all have to meet our fell destiny, and Albert's uncle is not extirpated from this awful law. Now the finding of the long-lost was the very last thing we did for the sake of its being a noble act. So that is the end of the Would-be-Goods, and there are no more chapters after this. But Oswald hates books that finish up without telling you the things you might want to know about the people in the book, so here goes.
We went home to the beautiful Blackheath house. It seemed very stately and mansion-like after the moat house, and everyone was most frightfully pleased to see us. Mrs. Pettigrew cried when we went away. I never was so astonished in my life. She made each of the girls a fat red pincushion like a heart, and each of us boys had a knife brought out of the housekeeping. Housekeeper's own money. Bill Simpkins is happy as sub-under-gardener to Albert's uncle's lady's mother. They do keep 3 gardeners, I knew they did. And our tramp still earns enough to sleep well on from our dear old pigman. Our last 3 days were entirely filled up with visits of farewell sympathy to all our many friends who were so sorry to lose us. We promised to come and see them next year. I hope we shall. Denny and Daisy went back to live with their father at Forest Hill. I don't think they'll ever be again the victims of the Murdstone aunt, who is really a great aunt and about twice as much in the autumn of her days as our new Albert's uncle's aunt. I believe they plucked up spirit enough to tell their father that they didn't like her, which they'd never thought of doing before. Our own Robber says their holidays in the country did them both a great deal of good, and he says us Bastables have certainly taught Daisy and Denny the rudiments of the art of making home happy. I believe they have thought of several quite new naughty things entirely on their own, and done them too, since they came back from the moat house. I wish you didn't grow up so quickly. Oswald can see that ere long he will be too old for the kind of games we can all play, and he feels grown-upness creeping inordiously upon him. But enough of this. And now, gentle reader, farewell. If anything in these chronicles of the Wouldbegoods should make you try to be good yourself, the author will be very glad, of course. But take my advice, and don't make a society for trying it. It is much easier without.
And do try to forget that Oswald has another name besides Bastable, the one beginning with C, I mean. Perhaps you have not noticed what it was. If so, don't look back for it is a name no manly boy would like to be called by if he spoke the truth. Oswald is said to be a very manly boy, and he despises that name and will never give it to his own son when he has one. Not if a rich relative offered to leave him an immense fortune if he did. Oswald would still be firm. He would, on the honour of the House of Bastable.
End of chapter 14.
And end of the Wouldbegoods by E. Nesbit, being the further adventures of the treasure seekers.
Read by Alan at Hazelchant of Tunbridge in Kent, England, in 2007 and 2008.
And very nearly 2009.